Michael Tymn is an author, journalist, and runner. Over his 50-year writing career, he has focused on running and the transcendental. In his book, Transcending the Titanic, which was published just before the 100-year anniversary of the Titanic's sinking on April 15, 1912, he writes about the transcendental aspects of the Titanic story: the premonitions, apparitions, out-of-body experiences, telepathic communication among the living, and after-death communications. In this EAH meeting, he highlights some of the stories of the passengers that showed the range of human emotions: bravery and cowardice, love and fear, selfishness and brotherhood, and the transcendental.
Good afternoon, everybody. We have a very exciting program today. But as usual, we always have a little business to do first. This is the second time now we've been in our new quarters here, which we really like. Great to see you all. And first of all, my partner, Bill, has a few words to say about the science fair that we've spent a few days with.
The science and engineering fair. And architects. So, 3 days, and we spent $300 for 5 prizes. We gave $100 for each 3 prizes. So the 3 prizes went to the following. The senior research was won by Catherine Sarte. She's from Waipahu High School. Her project was strength of bridges, truss suspension, and cable-stayed bridges, the 3 kinds. That was senior research. Junior research was won by a team, and they were from Niu Valley Elementary. Intermediate, rather. The 2 were Micah Miyashiro and Marcus Tequina. Roof designs and like green roofs and things like that. And the last one was junior display by a team. Kaina Kanui and Jordan Wayalama. And their project was Cars of the Future, subtitle Alternate Energy Cars. So those were the 3 projects.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you very much. I'll just remind you, next week's meeting will be April 20th, and the speaker will be Bill Spencer, CEO of Hawaii Oceanic Technology. And so I hope we'll all be there for that one. And with that, I think we'll dispense with the joke today. And can't do that? Oh, all right then. I know somebody's been waiting to tell us a joke, so we'll cancel that.
The story is about a lady who goes to heaven, and she meets a friend of hers. And she says, "How did you die?" And her friend says, "I froze to death." And she says, "Oh, that must have been terrible." She says, "No, after the shaking stopped, it all got warm, and then I just seemed to go asleep. But how did you die?" And she said, "Oh, I had a heart attack. I was positive my husband was seeing another woman, and I rushed home in the middle of the day, but he was at the computer, but I suspected the girl was in the house. So I ran upstairs, searched all the doors, or rooms, went down the basement, searched there, started to run up the stairs again, and I had a heart attack and died." And our friend said, "Oh, that's too bad. If you'd looked in the freezer, we'd both be alive today."
Very good. Well, talking of death, we're going to be talking a little bit about death today, and I'm about to introduce my friend and speaker, Mike Tymn. I think we're all pretty familiar with him. He's quite a well-known author. He's written a lot of books, mostly on running and dying, and lives in Kailua, and he did speak to us, I think it was last year. And today, to hear about the Titanic, you think about, the sinking and all of these things, but this goes much beyond that, and this goes beyond the sinking of the Titanic, and it really is a fascinating book. I was fortunate enough to be given a copy by Mike a few weeks ago. It is a delightful book. I hope you have some books here with you? Oh, no books yet. Oh dear, that's a shame. Anyway, well, let's enjoy the ride or the voyage, and here's Mike.
Thank you. I think it was a year and a half ago I talked to the group on running, and I spent 40 years in the insurance business, although I majored in journalism in college. I've been a freelance writer ever since I graduated from college, 55 years ago, whenever it was. Since I retired from the insurance business, I've done a lot of writing for magazines. I have my 5th book is now coming out. This particular topic came up. I write for Atlantis Rising magazine. I don't know if any of you ever heard of that, but it's a pretty popular magazine. It can be found on the newsstand and the bookstores. And the editor asked me, he says, last October, he said, 100th anniversary of the Titanic is next April. Can you write something for the March issue? I said, well, what am I going to write that hasn't already been said? And he asked me to go into the more mystical aspects of the Titanic. And after I got to doing the magazine article, I realized I got enough here for a book. And so I put it together in about a month, and it came out in January, I think. And it hasn't broken the top 100 yet in books sold. But anyway, it was fun doing. I don't know which researchers turned this up, but they say that in the non-English speaking world, there are 3 words that stand out. The top 3 words among non-English speaking people are God, Coca-Cola, and Titanic. Everybody in foreign countries knows those words. And I think, at this time, probably Titanic has taken over number 1 because, as probably you all know, the 100th anniversary is this Sunday, and there's been something in the paper about it every day and on TV, on the internet. It's hard to turn any kind of media on or look at any media and not say something about the Titanic. So it's all coming to a peak on Sunday with the 100th anniversary. I'm not really going to get too much into the mystical aspects of it here because some people find it offensive. There's a lot of after-death communications in my book, and I'm dealing with, in effect, three groups. We have the religious fundamentalists on one side who say it's all demonic. And on the other side, we have the scientific fundamentalists who say it's all religious superstition. So I don't know what group you fall into here, or whether you're in the middle or whatever, but I'm not really going to go into that other than Premonitions. What I am going to dwell on is the first chapter of my book, How People Faced Up to Death. And let me begin with a little story related by Colonel Archibald Gracie. He was a 53-year-old New York gentleman. Now, it sounds strange to say he's a gentleman, but back in 1912, a gentleman was not what a gentleman is today. A gentleman was somebody who was independently wealthy and didn't work a 9-to-5 job. Now, he had the title colonel, but I don't think he was retired from the military. He served in the Spanish-American War, and I guess because of his gentleman status that he was able to keep the colonel title and be a gentleman at the same time. But anyway, he was one of the last people off the ship, if not the last. As it was going down, he dove in and he got sucked down. Apparently the suction aspect wasn't as great as many people think it should have been. He remembers being sucked down. He has no idea how long it took him to surface, but he feels that because he had a life preserver on, he probably wasn't sucked down as far as he would have if he didn't have the life preserver on. Anyway, he surfaced and made his way to an overturned auxiliary raft that had about 15 other people already on it, most of them crew members. They had to climb aboard this overturned raft, and one of them pulled Colonel Gracie up, and he was freezing. It was 28-degree water, and he saw this guy next to him who appeared to be a stoker, a member of the crew, and he had a wool cap on, and Colonel Gracie asked him if he could borrow the cap just for a minute, just to get warm and give it right back to him, and the stoker said, well, what would I do? Gracie said, he thought to himself, he wrote a book about this after 6 months or so after he recovered, and he said, oh, well, what difference will it make in 100 years? So, anyway, he survived. Okay, this is a picture of the Titanic in all its glory before it left Southampton, England, on its fatal maiden voyage. It doesn't really, compared to today's ships, it doesn't really look like much, but back then it was, a floating palace. We might ask, why is the Titanic story, why is it fascinated so much today? What is it about the Titanic that, everybody marvels over? There have been a number of theories on this. Let me back up a little bit and say that this is certainly not the biggest disaster in maritime disaster. We had in 1865, there was the Sultana, which was a Mississippi River steamboat that killed 1,547 people when it blew up on the Mississippi River. That's about 30 more than Titanic, but the biggest one was just 25 years ago in the Philippines. The Dona Paz, I guess it's pronounced. Over 4,000 people were killed when the Dona Paz collided with an oil tanker. So clearly the number of fatalities is not the biggest factor, that why we remember this and not other disasters. My theory is that we see the Titanic as a microcosm of life. It was a community in the middle of the ocean with the elite, middle class, and lower class, the steerage passengers. But it had every emotion, mindset, and virtue and vice depicted in the story, and I'm sure most of you have seen one or more of the movies. Those emotions and vices and so forth are love and fear, hope and despair, bravery and cowardice, arrogance and humbleness, pomp and shame, selfishness and brotherhood. So all these things come out in the story among the various victims. And at the core of all this is man's fear of death. In his 1974 Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Denial of Death, anthropologist Ernest Becker wrote, "The idea of death, the fear of it, haunts the human mind like nothing else." And Becker went on to say that to free himself of the anxiety of death, man buries the idea deep in his subconscious and busies himself with his life and seeks a mundane security that he expects to continue indefinitely. Now, William James, who was a pioneering psychologist, and Carl Jung, who was another pioneering psychologist, they also said what Becker said, that death is at the foundation of our emotions. They disagreed with Freud, who said that the sex drive was the fundamental thing that drives us. They went one step lower and said death is the thing that drives us. So stories like the Titanic give us an opportunity to examine death in a safe haven. And of course we see death portrayed in so many different stories and on TV and in the movies and so forth, but the one thing that really stands out about the Titanic is that people had time to anticipate their death. That's something we don't see in most stories. Before I go on, first a few facts about the Titanic. It was built in 1909 to 1911 by Harland Wolff Shipyards in Belfast. Dimensions were 882.5 feet long, 92 feet width, so nearly 3 football fields. It carried 3,339 passengers and crew, or had a capacity rather of 339 passengers and crew, but they only had 2,223 passengers and crew aboard, so only about 2/3 full at the time. They had 1,324 paying passengers, 909 crew members. There were 20 lifeboats with a capacity of 1,178. There were 710 survivors and 1,513 deaths. The route was from Southampton to Cherbourg, I guess it's pronounced, in France, then to Queenstown in Ireland, and then it was headed for New York City. Okay, here's a little timeline. April 14th, 11:40 p.m., it hits the iceberg. April 15th, 12:15 a.m., women are urged to head for the lifeboats. 12:45 a.m., first lifeboat lowered. 1:10 a.m., first explosion. 1:30 a.m., word passed that the ship appears doomed. 1:55 a.m., the last standard lifeboat was lowered. 2 a.m., another explosion, and lights go out. 2:05 a.m., entire bow is now underwater. 2:05 a.m. again, the last Engelhart boat, which was a small lifeboat, was launched. At 2:10 a.m., the ship begins breaking apart. At 2:15, with the front part of the ship broken away and headed for the bottom, the stern rises to a perpendicular position. And at 2:20, the stern of the ship sinks. And then nearly 2 hours later, the Carpathia, which picked up the survivors, arrives on the scene, and it took about 3 to 4 hours to collect all the passengers aboard. To fully understand the mindset of the passengers, you have to understand the time that this took place in. 1859, Darwin wrote his famous book on the origin of the species, and it took about 10 years for his book to really catch on. At that time, mass communications was not that great. So it took about 10 years. About 1870, 1880, people were suffering from what was called soul sickness. They just couldn't reconcile Darwin's ideas with the ideas they'd been brought up with in the church. There was no compromise between the two. So many of the educated people, the college educated, the enlightened and so forth, had no belief at all. They had become atheists, and the whole philosophy had become eat, drink, and be merry. William James, again shown here, he was one of the pioneering psychologists. He himself said he suffered from soul sickness. He just couldn't accept the fact that he was going to die and be extinct upon his death. And in fact, he considered committing suicide, and then had a change of heart on that. This is one of the men who helped turn things around. Most people think that the theory of evolution came from Darwin alone, but this man is considered the co-originator of the natural selection theory, Alfred Russel Wallace. He actually came up with his own theory. He talked to Darwin about it, and their combined paper was presented in England in 1858. But Darwin gets all the credit because he wrote the book the following year. But anyway, Wallace, somewhere around 1865, he began investigating mediumship, which was really catching on at that time. And he became convinced that he was communicating with spirits of the dead. Of course, his brother scientist thought he was crazy, and he didn't get very far, but he did happen to educate quite a few people in the area of spiritualism, as it was called then, mediumship, and that helped soften the so-called soul sickness. So, and then there were a number of other other scientists and educated men. Sir Oliver Lodge, who was a British physicist. Frederic Myers, also, he wasn't a scientist, but he was a lecturer in the classics in England, and a number of other people in England who promoted spiritualism, or spirit communication as it was called, and that helped keep things sort of afloat as far as a belief in an afterlife was concerned. Okay, this man is probably the chief character in my book. His name is William Stead, spelled S-T-E-A-D, but pronounced Stead, and he was one of the victims of the Titanic. In 1886, some 16 years before the Titanic went down, Stead wrote a novel. He was a British journalist. He wrote a novel about a ship that was lost because there were too few lifeboats. And then in 1892, he wrote about the sinking of a ship that hit an iceberg, and another ship called the Majestic had a psychic aboard the ship. And the psychic told the captain that, somewhere ahead, 100 miles or whatever it was, a ship is sunk, hit an iceberg, and passengers need to be rescued. So anyway, the whole story centered around hitting an iceberg, passengers being rescued. But one of the funny things is that the name of the captain of the Majestic was this man here, Edward J. Smith, who happened to be the captain of the Titanic. So whether or not Stead has some kind of subconscious premonition, it's hard to say. Smith actually captained the Titanic, the Majestic, but not until 3 years after Stead wrote his novel about it. In a 1909 book, 3 years before the Titanic sank, Stead gave a lecture saying that he believed in life after death, and he wrote, "In order to form a definite idea of the problem which we're about to attack, let us imagine the grave as if it were the Atlantic Ocean." So little did he think or realize consciously that 3 years later that the Atlantic Ocean would be his grave. And then while the Titanic was being built, the Reverend Archdeacon Colley printed a pamphlet entitled "The Fore-Ordained Wreck of the Titanic." And he sent a copy to Stead, who thanked him but said, I'm going to take my chances and go ahead. I tried to find a copy of that book, but I haven't been successful. In 1898, this man, Morgan Robertson, he was an American novelist, wrote a story about a British passenger ship called the Titan, said to be unsinkable and to have too few lifeboats. And guess what? It hit an iceberg and sunk. 1898, 14 years before the actual Titanic. So are these coincidences, or is there some kind of subconscious premonition going on? This man, his name was Jacques Futrelle. He was an American novelist. He had a premonition 2 weeks before the Titanic went down. Sent a cable to his brother, or brother-in-law, saying, "Turn down the glass for me." He also sent his brother-in-law a power of attorney and instructions relative to the care of their children. And he was another victim. His wife survived, but he did not. This is an artist's depiction of the Titanic sinking that came out right after the disaster. It's not accurate in the sense of the sea was very calm, so the big waves there are not too accurate, but otherwise it appears to be an accurate description. Okay, the stories related by some of the survivors suggest three basic approaches to death. One was dignified or stoic resignation. Two, controlled trembling. And three, uncontrolled trembling or panic. This man, Major Archibald Butt, probably falls in the first class, dignified or stoic resignation. He was an aide to President Howard Taft and was on his way to see Taft. He was going to be talking to a group at Carnegie Hall along with William Stead. I didn't mention that Stead was on his way to Carnegie Hall to give a lecture on peace, on world peace. But Butt was seen by many survivors of the ship, helping people aboard, directing traffic, taking over from the various crewmen who didn't know what they were doing, and loading the passengers, and just very calmly helping out. Okay, this is, if you've seen the movies, you probably heard about Isidor and Rosalie Strauss. They were, Isidor was one of the founders of the Macy's department stores, and they remained on the ship. Rosalie, or as she was called, Ida, had an opportunity to get on one of the lifeboats, but she elected to stay with the ship. Now the big question is, on all these people who elected to stay on the ship, was it because they were really heroic, or was it because they didn't expect the ship to go down? And many of the testimonies after the disaster indicated that people stayed on the ship because it looked riskier getting on the lifeboats than it did than staying on the ship. So they were watching the lifeboats being lowered in jerks and jolts, and one of the boats fell about 10 feet, last 10 feet into the water, and there were just many people who remained on the ship that said, "Hey, we're not going to go out in those lifeboats. That's riskier." And they expected, they had heard that the ship wasn't going to sink, and they felt their chances were better by staying on the ship rather than getting in the lifeboat. Okay, this is William Stead, whose picture we saw before. He was also seen helping passengers get on the lifeboats in a very calm manner. He was seen somewhat later sitting in the men's smoking room reading a book, and then just before, as the last lifeboat left, he was waving to one of the passengers, very calm, cool, and collected. Now this man has gone down in history as one of the biggest cowards. Bruce Ismay, who was the owner of White Star, the president of White Star Line, who happened to board one of the lifeboats. There's some debate as to whether he got on one of the first ones or one of the last ones. He said that he got on either the last or the next to last lifeboat, and it was because there just weren't enough passengers, that it wasn't being filled up. There was still room, and he didn't see any point in actually staying on the ship when there was still room in a lifeboat. So whether he was a coward or not, that's up for judgment. Actually, there were 338 men who survived the Titanic, and initially the press branded them all as cowards. When there were so many women who didn't survive. But the point is that They were directed to the lifeboats. Many of the first dozen lifeboats weren't filled up, and so they were told to get aboard. There was those like Colonel Archibald Gracie who survived in the water. There were about 40 or 50 of them that were picked out of the water after the ship went down. And there were the crew members who were told to get on the lifeboats and help out and do the rowing. Can't see this very well, but you've all heard, I'm sure, of the ship's orchestra, how they played right down to the 10 minutes before the ship went down, very heroically. There's some debate as to whether, as depicted in the various movies, "Nearer, My God, to Thee" was their final piece. Colonel Gracie and a number of other people said they didn't hear it. There are about 3 people who testified that was their final hymn, but that's up to debate, and there has been some recent articles saying that the orchestra may have lulled the passengers into a false sense of security by leading them to believe that everything was fine. Had they not been playing, maybe the passengers would have filled up the earlier lifeboats. Again, subject to debate. The mother of John Hume, I think this is Hume, but I'm not sure. She had a premonition and told her son to stay home. Something terrible is going to happen, but he just sort of laughed it off, and all of them were victims of the Titanic. John Jacob Astor and his wife Madeline, he was considered the richest man in the world at the time. He was one of those who declined to get on one of the early lifeboats or let his wife was only 18 years old at the time, board the lifeboat. But towards the end, he realized what was happening, and he put her aboard, and he started to climb aboard, and he was told he couldn't go, it's for women only, so he backed off, and he also was one of the victims. This man is Dr. Henry Frauenthal. He was a New York City physician. He probably goes in the last category, the panic or uncontrolled trembling, because he jumped from the deck into one of the lifeboats that was being lowered and landed on 2 women, breaking the ribs of one and injuring the other one. So he wasn't very heroic. Okay, this is Lady Christina Duff Gordon. She was one of the survivors. They were in one of the early lifeboats that only had 12 people in it, and it had a capacity of 40-something. And after the ship went down, a couple of the people in the lifeboat suggested that they go back and pick up some of the survivors, so they could hear screaming and crying and yelling. And she said, "No, we're going to get swamped." And her husband, Sir Cosmo Duff, agreed. And so instead of going back to pick up survivors, they went the other direction. Now, what would have happened if they had gone back? Would they have been swamped? I mean, that's a good question. I mean, it's difficult to put yourself in that position, but there were a number of boats that did not go back and pick up passengers. Okay, this is the man I started out with, Colonel Archibald Gracie. This is one of the Engelhart boats, it's the type that was overturned that Colonel Gracie and the others were on. After he got on this overturned life raft, he observed that many other swimmers were trying to get on the boat, but it was already filled up. So that those people already on the overturned boat were kicking away people, hitting them over the head, and just generally pushing them away. And then he recalls one very transcendent moment when some man swam up to the boat and said, "Any room, boys? Can I get aboard?" And somebody yelled at him, "No, go away." So his comment was, "All right, boys, good luck and God be with you." And he swam away. Now, nobody has ever, this man was also mentioned in the testimony of several crew members after the Senate investigation in the United States and investigation in Great Britain. Several people mentioned this heroic man who swam up and then heroically swam away. And nobody's ever really been able to identify him. But in doing the research for my book, I think I came across an identity of him. Okay, I think this man, this heroic person, was Reverend Robert Bateman, who was also a physician. He, before the ship went down, he put his sister-in-law, who had accompanied him in a group to England for a survival meeting, revival meeting, on one of the lifeboats, and his last comments to her were, "Goodbye, God bless you." So again, when Colonel Gracie heard the man say, "All right, boys, good luck and God bless you," it sounds like it could have been Bateman. He was found, his body floating in the ocean about 3 weeks later by an oil tanker. Now, 10 days after the disaster, Bateman's widow received a letter from her husband that had been mailed when the Titanic stopped in Ireland. And he wrote, "I feel that my trip has not been in vain. God has blessed me. We had a glorious revival. It was the time of my life." He wrote to his nephew, Tom, "Tom, if this ship goes to the bottom, I shall not be there. I shall be up yonder. Think of it." And then, about a month after the disaster, his wife unlocked his roll-down desk and found a poem that Bateman had written before he left, and it read, "Do you shudder as you picture all the horrors of that hour? Ah, but Jesus was beside me, to sustain me by his power, and he came himself to meet me, in that way so hard to tread, and with Jesus' arm to cling to, could I have one doubt or dread." So, did he have a premonition? I don't know. There are a dozen more premonitions that I could go into, but I touched upon the main ones. There were just many people at that time who assumed that the ship was going to meet with disaster, and obviously it did. So we get back to the question, Colonel Gracie's question, will it matter 100 years from now? That's the question. People, apparently it does matter because of all the interest that we're finding in the subject now. As I said, I didn't, I'll just take 2 more minutes. I didn't really want to go into the after-death communication, but one of the, William Stead appeared before, through a number of mediums. Whether you believe in mediums or not, it's up to you, but there's a lot of evidential material that came out. And this is one of the things that came through one of the mediums from William Stead. He said, "The whole scene was indescribably pathetic. Many, knowing what had occurred, were in agony of doubt as to their people left behind and as to their own future state. What would it hold for them? Would they be taken to see him? What would their sentence be? Others were almost mental wrecks. They knew nothing. They seemed to be uninterested in everything. Their minds were paralyzed. A strange crew indeed of human souls waiting their ratings in the new land. A matter of a few minutes in time only, and here were hundreds of bodies floating in the water, dead. Hundreds of souls carried through the air, alive, very much alive. Some were. Many, realizing their death had come, were engaged at their own powerlessness to save their valuables. They fought to save what they had on earth prized so much." That's it. Thank you.
Mike, thank you very much. Boy, that really brought everything back to life. I think it was an incredible presentation, Mike. Thank you very much. What's your next book going to be about?
Leonora Piper, who was one of the famous mediums at the time.
Good. Well, we'll look forward to that. Anyway, but that's all for this week, and we hope to see you all again next week. Oh, wait a minute, yes. I wonder why Bill was pushing me.
And turn it around so the world can see. If you are interested in the book, you just go to Amazon.com and put in Transcending the Titanic. It's available on Kindle as well as hardcover.
But these are adjourned, everybody.
Engineers and architects of Hawaii welcome your comment on this program and any of our recent programs. We encourage your direct participation in this community outreach. So please email us your comments and ideas at eahawaii@gmail.com.